Welcome to the Purpose Studio. I'm your co-host, Nida El-Relami, and this is a podcast for founders, creatives, and purpose-led leaders building with heart and community in mind. We're a global studio from New York to Bali and beyond, creating a space for real, honest conversations about the journey of leading, building, and living with purpose and true impact. Each episode dives into inner transformation, conscious leadership, and bold ideas reshaping our world today. So let's meet our guest and dive into today's episode. Welcome to the Purpose Studio. I would love for you both to tell us who you are, where you're based. So who wants to start? Do you want to start, Vijayta?
Thanks so much for having us, Nada. My name is Vijayta Narang. I am based in Bangalore, India. Currently in the middle of a bit of a life transition. I just wrapped up 7 years living in New York City, where I was working in the climate action space at a nonprofit, and previously was studying global affairs, so international development and peace building. That was a whole journey, and now I've closed the chapter and I'm now back at home in Bangalore, India, where I'm from, working as an affiliated researcher with the Peace Research and Education program at NYU, where I also did my master's, and about to start a new venture as well, and in general working on a lot of collaborations that have carried over from my time in the US that all sort of relate to very similar topics around climate justice, decolonial technology, and participatory and radical funding.
I'm Marine Collins Renier. I'm based in New York and I work at the Peace Research and Education program. I started an initiative there about 2 years ago that looks at AI and the intersection of peace building. And so we're trying to build more community-oriented AI systems, but we're also looking at how AI can support peace and peace processes. And so we're working in countries like Kenya, Malawi, the Philippines, and maybe Syria soon. And I'm very excited to kind of talk a little bit about the work that we've done and some of our findings, and also to be on a podcast with my friend Vijayta that I've been working with for the last year.
Thank you so much, both of you. I'm really excited because even for the last several months, we've been kind of tuning in with each other to discuss your research and where you are both at. But I really love this because when I did my master's in peace building at the same program that both of you were in, I did blockchain and peace building partnership as my thesis. And so even back then I was like, there's this whole world that is evolving and changing radically, and I want this discipline to be a part of that. And what does that even look like? Because peace building is such a fascinating space and it's so important. And I'm really happy that you both are taking this forward. And so that leads me to my first questions. How did you first become interested in this intersection of technology, peace building, and colonialism? And can you define some of these fields and share the lenses through which you are doing your research and your work, both of you? Because I think it's really interesting, and also help the listeners understand what is even peace building and why it relates to this context when we're talking about tech.
I also wanted to say, Nada, I'd love to hear a bit more about your research as well. My path wasn't very linear. Kind of started my career in advertising. I think Vijayta did as well. I think we were working for a similar agency, but in completely different countries. Shifted to diplomacy, and then joined the State Department, where I was doing research on disinformation and misinformation campaigns and looking at tools that can help counter, analyze, and understand mis and disinformation campaigns worldwide. And that's when I kind of understood that a lot of these tools were very kind of far removed from the contexts where they were being implemented. And there was a big gap between the kind of goal that they were trying to achieve, which, I mean, technically they were very efficient, but they weren't able to, there was no trust from communities. There was no accountability for these tools. And so it felt really important to bring in that community angle, which has really been the cornerstone of how we approach the work and how we kind of incorporate peace building into the tech work that we're doing today with So we've been looking at our research through various angles. Data colonization is one. That's a term that's kind of been around for a few years. That was pinned, I think, first by researchers Coldry and Mejias. And they basically realized that data was being extracted in the same way that land used to be, that it basically these big corporations were considering that data was kind of up for grabs and going on into all these different countries, using this data, monetizing it, and then none of the profits were going back to the communities. And so they did a whole research around these topics, and it's since kind of expanded. Some other researchers have talked about, I think, algorithmic coloniality. Difficult words to pronounce that's from research showing that some of these tools are tested out in countries of the global south before they're marketed to people of the global north. So they're kind of using the global south as guinea pigs before they even deploy these tools in Western markets. And so there's a whole field that's emerged, and that's really kind of been an angle that we've been looking at our work from. And that's been very interesting.
If you just want to go deeper into the peace building work and also like why this relates to peace building, what is peace building? Because your work is in urban tech is focused on community centered lens as well, and you bring in the peace building lens. So if you want to elaborate even more.
Yeah. Happy to. And as Marine was saying, and as Marine implied, I also have come from a bit of a diverse professional background. I've taken many left turns. I got started in the film industry, actually. I used to work in film production, first in New York, then in Bollywood. I will skip all of the stuff that happened in the middle, but I ended up studying peace building and international development at NYU the same year Marine did, actually. And we met at the introduction to peace building class. That's where the two of us first sort of met and realized that we both also lived in Mumbai at the same time.
Oh.
And I think there a bond was instantly
That
in
is
the same
insane.
neighborhood.
Wow. Yeah,
Like
meant to be.
Small world. We never crossed
Yeah.
paths, but we lived not far from each other for at least, I think we had at least a year of overlap.
Is that what they call the red string theory?
I do believe that there are invisible strings that connect you to certain people, and that certain people were meant to be in your life, and that life will keep pulling you into each other's orbits. And I feel like I've actually, in some of my more emotional moments, which there are many, have definitely expressed this very sappily to Marine, because the two of us have definitely like come together as collaborators, as friends in different ways over the years. I mean, we hung out in the freezing cold during COVID. So if that doesn't bond you for life, I don't know what does. Anyways, I studied peace building and international development at the Center for Global Affairs at NYU, and was something that I've always been interested in, and what led me to take to peace building as a field of theory and practice the way I did was that I have always been curious as to what the fundamental drivers of societal decision making and institution building are. What causes the pillars of our human society, the way we know it, to exist in the way it does, in the forms it does, and what can inspire people to change their minds? Change their perspectives, change their processes, change their decision making. I think those are the things that drew me to theater and filmmaking, so the arts as tools for that. And then that sort of eventually led me sort of up the funnel to peace building and more direct contact with the process of institutional and structural reform or building. And I very much was questioning my ability to exist as an actor in the peace building field the way it exists, because I think peace building is an amazing field of practice, and I think it is very necessary. To define peace building for anyone who might not be very familiar with it, there are many definitions, but I think the simplest thing I can boil it down to is that peace building as a process focuses on getting to the root cause of why a conflict occurred in the first place. Peace building maintains that the state of peace is not achieved just by the cessation of violent conflict of any kind. What peace is a sustained state of progress and development that is anchored by oftentimes healthy institutions that support the ability of people to have dignified lives, healthy societal relationships, whether it's interpersonal or between people and institutions of governance and different institutions of influence within a society or a community. And that might look different from one community to the next. For example, certain communities might feature religious institutions playing influential roles as change makers. And so they are actors that are active parties to the ability to have peace or the ability to stop conflict in a community. Yeah. So what I was really drawn to is this notion that peace is a state that is enabled by, if I were to boil it down to a few things, and it's more complicated than that, but if I were to give some examples, lack of education, lack of access to healthcare, lack of access to fundamental resources required to lead a healthy, stable life, water, food, the lack of proper institutions of governance and welfare that would support a healthy society, lack of jobs. So really thinking through what are the drivers of unrest and that could lead to violence of different kinds in a community, in a society, between two communities. I would say that is sort of encompasses what peace building sets out to achieve, is to say that to prevent violent conflict from happening again, we must address the root cause of why this happened in the first place. And that usually is a deeper and more far-reaching story. I was very much questioning my place in this field. I'm a person who comes from a privileged background in India. I was studying in the US, and one of the critiques often found in the peacebuilding field is that the processes are usually facilitated or overseen by practitioners who represent, oftentimes who come from global north contexts or contexts that are not of the site of conflict, which there is a role for them to play very actively. But there is usually, if it is not done successfully, if relationships are not built well, if there is not full integration of the practitioner within the impacted communities, it also can be very prescriptive in terms of who gets to decide what peace and what solution building looks like in this context. And I personally, on a personal level, was questioning my right to be in contexts that I knew nothing about, working in them. And I was also questioning this from an international development perspective because I was studying that at the time. Through that, I found myself looking at opportunities domestically in the US, and I essentially ended up interning at a nonprofit, and essentially it was working in the field of urban tech, trying to very actively de-silo the ecosystem of actors who are involved from different perspectives in the process of building, deploying, and scaling urban tech solutions in different cities across the US. And urban tech is essentially any technology that contributes to the development of a smarter and more sustainable city. So this could look like buildings technology, urban agriculture, accessibility technology, security technology, which, by the way, I knew very little about, but was very interested in the overlaps between the fundamental concept of we need an ecosystem to be interwoven in an intersectional manner in order for these solutions to be able to scale successfully and reach people successfully in the first place. And we need to connect missing links in order to ensure a stable foundation from which these things can actually happen. And I came into it basically saying, how can I apply peace building theory and concept to this work? Because I do see a lot of very similar systemic issues in the New York context that I have read about. In peacebuilding classes, I'm reading case studies from a lot of different sub-Saharan African localities as well. And I think it would be remiss to think that the US context is any more lacking in the same fundamental issues that lead to conflict than any place in the global south. And so I was very interested to see if I could flip the sort of work and invert what I was learning in peacebuilding to a very domestic US context. Marine, I'm actually curious if you have anything to add, because we've had so many conversations. You have come into this work. You've also done a lot of you've done a lot of the international work.
Yeah. I became a diplomat before I studied peace building. I think one of the, even without having that kind of peace building lens, I think one of the first things that really struck me in that field was the power dynamics that exist between the diplomats, the communities they're engaged with, even the actors in the local countries that they're working with. We were working in the Central African Republic, for example, advising governments, and you could clearly see, this kind of dependency that was created based on funding, based on the knowledge that supposed European, experts, as they called themselves, should have. And I thought that was I thought that was very wrong. And then when I took kind of a deeper dive into peace building, I really understood more and was able to kind of bring a more theoretical grounding to all of this. And I agree. I think it's also visible in the US. I think it's something that's applicable to a lot of contexts. We often talk about like a peace building Trojan horse, and I think that's what we're trying to do with tech. We're trying to embed these peace building principles of like trust, institution building into the tech ecosystem in the countries that we're working with, but also with the communities that we're working with.
I have a follow-up question to both of what you've shared. How hard has it been to bring in these peace building concepts and theory into spaces that are not typically looking at that? Like even the climate tech space, like I think I went to one conference a few years ago and I was just sitting in the chair and I was trying to engage, but everything was about profit and investors and yada yada. And I was just like sitting there and I was like, where's the conversation about how this is affecting the locals? I was just trying to find the humanness in all of this tech jargon. So I can imagine it's a little bit difficult to kind of have these conversations. So I'm interested in how both of you are bringing this into the tech space. Like, how are people even engaging with it? Are they even receptive?
I think if I can start, one of the things we do is we don't necessarily call it peace building because I think peace building, first of all, is a word that a lot of people don't understand. And I also think peace in itself has like, I don't know, it has a bit of it like a peace and love, like when you start talking to people in the tech world about peace, they're like, yeah. So I think that's how we kind of approach it. We use different words. We use community led. We use, building trusted institutions. We use, mediation. We use all these different words to kind of bring it in. What's been really interesting is that there's really been a big demand for the work that we've been doing, whether, it's in New York, the work that we've been doing with Vijayta, but also just internationally. There's been a lot of interest. And I think part of it is because, well, it's still kind of like a counter narrative now saying that, you're going to build tools with community and try to be as inclusive as possible. But I do think these models and these systems that they're developing are failing in various parts of the global south. So for example, a lot of like, if you look at tech, a lot of like tech applications don't speak necessarily the local languages. They're not built with community input, so communities don't trust them. They're built on like funding cycles that end, and so it's not sustainable. So I think slowly, some of these actors are understanding the importance of incorporating peace building, even if we're not calling it that way.
So the definition of peace is a conversation I have every single day because I decided to call my venture Peace Lab. And so I have a business mentor and he's constantly like, should we just change the name? But I'm like, it's not void, it's not void of conflict. There's so much in it. And it's, I kind of like the challenge of like trying to redefine it. But some days I'm like, I don't know if it's landing. Vijayta, do you have anything else to add about this or?
Well, I mean, to Marine's point, peace isn't sexy. And I also think that brings us to, I think, the conversation that, started, one of the many conversations that started Marine and I kind of down this road of working together on the research that we're working together on. Like you have to question, okay, I just said peace isn't sexy. Why isn't peace sexy? Because the people who have money and power do not think peace is sexy. We all know what they think is sexy. It's the opposite, right? It's also profitable. To your point, Nada, about your experience at the conference, right? It's a frustration that I share with you and was one of my biggest observations going into the urban tech space as we were trying to sort of do this ecosystem bridge building between government, public sector, private sector, VC, startup, nonprofit. Like the one gaping hole I noticed in all of this, which my former boss and I had a lot of conversations about, was the lack of inclusion of the end user of the technology, which in many cases, if it's urban tech, that's the citizen, right? Like where are the citizens? Where are the people on the ground in any of these ecosystems that everyone is trying to build? I really don't see that at all, right? And I think it was my initial sort of naivete and just like lack of exposure and knowledge of how the tech or the innovation economy works, that sort of was like, oh, if we were to just make a space for people, for end users or citizens to be a part of it, everything will change and all tech will be scaled easily because it will directly respond to what people need. It's unfortunately not as simple as that, I learned over the years.
I do have to ask because even I'm in an MBA program right now. And like the thing that we always have to come back to is the customer interviews, like thinking about that end user constantly because it's feedback. Maybe this is like a larger scale, and there's definitely different actors when you're talking about like urban tech, but why isn't it that simple?
I really was I was really practicing like my diplomatic lines for this for this conversation.
No, it's okay.
I don't think it's
okay.
think it's not that simple because that's not how capitalism works. And which I think actually is like we're kind of bringing us closer to, again, what Marine and I want. And that's not how capitalism works. Capitalism demands that we seek profit above all else. And if I were to kind of put this in the most simplistic way possible, this is very reductionistic, but what is profitable is not always what is good for the sort of most vulnerable, the most marginalized, the most people who need the most resources or who might actually benefit most from strategic and thoughtful use of technology. Like that's not necessarily profitable. I'm going to stop there maybe before we get into the more sort of decolonial tech part of this conversation. But one thing that I do want to share is, what we have found is that 90% of startups fail overall. And the single biggest reason, to take your point, Nada, that 42% of startups fail because there is no market need product or service that they're creating, right? And then you have to think about who is the startup ecosystem sort of dominated by? Who gets access to this ecosystem and the tools one needs to exist in this ecosystem in the first place? It is people who have the privilege, resources, and access to and socioeconomic access to the world that pushes you into the rooms with big investors, into incubator programs that will help you sort of like network and, get the financing, the VC financing you need to get off the ground. And it's a lot of people who have these big moonshot ideas, right? Because they have certain experiences that do not encompass a vast majority of the people of this world and what they need, or their what the most vulnerable people in their communities might need. So it is not actually grounded in an intersectional, ground up knowledge or contextual knowledge or understanding of what is needed in their cities or their communities. And you will be surprised as to how easy it is to not talk to someone and not talk to your customer. I used to work in market research. It's very easy to talk to the same 10 people who represent community of different kinds. It's very hard to actually talk to and understand the person who might actually be interacting with your product, and then also run the risk of it being invalidated. I think that technology is very promising. I think technology is a fundamentally neutral thing, but what we increasingly see is that the way technology manifests and exists in this world is a direct reflection of the people who are creating it, their interests, their experiences, their biases, their worldviews. So that sort of is what has piqued my interest over the years, is what might a different reality look like.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate the honesty and passion, the vulnerability that was coming up, because we are called the Purpose Studio. I think these types of conversations are so important. There's no linear path to one end goal of purpose, and you are going to see all of these things that that you have identified as problems in the startup ecosystem or with capitalism. All of these things need to be considered. We're not talking about this fluffy space that we get to of purpose. I want to be able to discuss what are real situations and scenarios that people are involved in, because I think even I was talking to the founder of Live Better Creatives in the Purpose Studio yesterday. We had an episode together, and she's based in Bali, and she was discussing a lot of the problems in Bali. And it's so easy to have this impact goal, but we need the fire. It's the same way. When I wrote my thesis on blockchain and peace building, I was working with Radical Flexibility Fund, and we were partnered with Topple Blockchain, and they were working to create tokens based off of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so we were working a lot with social enterprises, sub-Saharan Africa, to create the standards of how what these tokens would be. But one of the most frustrating things, and I was really early on, like I was in grad school, so I was writing my thesis, and it was the first time that I had been kind of introduced into more of the corporate startup-y world, and I was very dumbfounded, and I think very naive also, of how so many of these metrics were being ignored, and so much of the storytelling was being ignored, even to create standards for these tokens. And I was like, this is an amazing technology. It's like, this could, like, the reason why I studied blockchain was because I was like, this is, to me, a solution to handle inequality. Like, I was like, I want to see more agency and power in the hands of marginalized communities. And I think this is one of the solutions. Like you said, it's a very neutral thing, technology. But when you see these spaces, and a lot of these actors have their own lenses coming in and their own metrics of how they measure impact, it was really hard to come in kind of like with the emotional human side of things and saying why this matters to be part of your standard. It was just like all of these things that I feel like were just neglected, and I didn't feel very like equipped to kind of fight for that. And if there's the right space. I feel very passionate about this too. Marine, if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, definitely. That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing your experience. I actually think technology is not neutral, because technology is always programmed by a human, and that human will always embed their biases into the technology and the data that they're going to be incorporating into the tech as well. Like create their own data sets with communities, or try to source data sets in an ethical way. The data sets that currently exist, I think, are already quite biased. So when you're looking at the development of an AI tool, I think it's very difficult to create something that's not already biased, even with the best intention. If you're working with a company in Silicon Valley, or you're using with data sets that you're like buying and that are already available. There was actually like an Oxford research that came out a few days ago that was really interesting. They asked ChatGPT who the smartest countries in the world were. And as you can imagine, there was like a massive discrepancy between countries of the global north and countries of the global south. But it also asked it, like, according to you, what are the smartest cities? And the smartest city, according to ChatGPT, is Boston, because I think a lot of the tech Silicon guys are MIT and Harvard, and they kind of just incorporate. And I think it's fascinating to see that this bias is incorporated into this technology already.
Wow. Well, let's get a little deeper. You spoke up before about the data colonialization, and it's been a term that's been used in the last few years. Can we talk about this more? What does it actually mean? How does it manifest in AI and tech today? And then I'll go back to your point in a second, because I am interested in how do you combat that biased data that's already out there.
Yeah, I could give an example from our work. So we were approached to build a tool in Malawi that was supposed to be an early warning system, help local communities report emergencies that they face during election periods. And the tool that the entity that we were working with, I won't name them, wanted to develop was basically a texting system in English that technologies could use to just like text emergencies across the country. And we kind of looked at it, had a few conversations with community members, and we were like, this is actually quite a Western way of looking at things, because the majority of the population doesn't speak English, and 30% of the population can't read or write. So like you're really just bringing in that Western perspective of what worked in the US or like in France, and to a country where the context is completely different. And so that was really interesting. And from that, we've been trying to build a tool that's, available in African languages, creating African data sets of these languages so that we're able to train the models, but also just because we want kind of more neutral data sets that we can use. And we're building a system that works even if you're not necessarily literate, so that you can just kind of speak in the phone and report your emergency. And we're doing that with the communities themselves. So we're having consultations with some of the like chiefs of villages and asking them like, what does an inclusive AI system look like to you, which has been really interesting.
The question was also about data colonialization. Like, what does this mean?
Yeah, it's really important. So basically 90% of the Global South's data is owned by Western companies. So that means Western companies go into countries around the Global South. They collect data sets either from, the way people are surfing them online or from the apps that they're already using. And then they bring those data sets back to, Virginia or whatever, develop apps that then they'll resell to these communities and make a profit out of it. So all these kind of citizens are contributing their data without even knowing it. We had a workshop in Kenya around kind of digital sovereignty in the country, and all the participants kept saying, basically, we're getting all these services for free from all these apps for free from Western companies, but we're paying in data, and like we don't necessarily understand it. And like the people who were in the workshop were like academics, and they understand the concept of like data sovereignty, but the average user, someone who's like working in an informal settlement, or they don't necessarily understand the implications of that. And that's what's going on in the global south everywhere. There's other examples of like indigenous communities who have like kind of sacred indigenous knowledge, and they find, that knowledge then finds itself on the internet being copied because basically been kind of stolen from them.
How important is data this day and age? Because it's so
Data-
valuable,
yeah.
and this is what you're pointing at, and most people don't even know that. I mean, it's one of the most precious assets right now.
Yeah, basically data is the new gold. You can't build an AI system without data. So that's why and one of the issues that we're facing right now is that we're actually running out of data. So we're creating synthetic data. So AI is creating AI data. Data is becoming less and less representative of humanity and humans. So that's how important data is.
I think just least common denominator with every single decision you make online, you are signing away a little window into how you behave, what your choices are, what your opinions are, how you choose to spend your time online. And that information is being sold by your browser provider, your internet provider, the service provider of whatever app you're using, to the biggest tech companies that, then can be accessed, as we have seen, by governments to actively clamp down on freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of movement, freedom of choice, your freedom as we're seeing in some parts of the world today, your freedom as a woman to make decisions about your own body. So I think baseline, that's what, all of us sort of sign up for. In a lot of the discourse on data colonialism, I think the big sort of alarm bell that a lot of practitioners and researchers in the field are ringing is that allowing data colonialism to be the norm and to happen in global majority, that's another term for global south countries, sets a precedent. It sets a precedent for it to happen to people from more privileged places as well. It's basically setting a precedent. If you allow it to happen to one people, to one place, it's going to come for you next. And no one is actually truly safe, which also comes down to no one is truly free until we're all free, right? And so, which is why we should care very much that it is. And I think that we're also seeing it happen in the most quote unquote places on earth as well. No one is safe. Anyone could be subpoenaed as well and under the wrong government. So yeah, no one is safe.
To kind of add to that on the importance of data, one kind of discourse that I've been hearing a lot lately that I think has been really interesting is that when you look at the EU, for example, they're trying to kind of catch up to the AI game, but one of the big impediments to them achieving that is that they do not have that data. So they have to buy their data from big American corporations, and so that's creates dependency in itself, which makes it difficult for them to ever lead in that space. So that we're talking about the EU. So you can imagine like countries from the global south, and what the situation might be for them. Another thing that I thought was quite interesting, I spoke to a NYU professor recently, and he's researching how basically when you're working with an AI at work, you're prompting it, you're training the data. And so he's looking at how, like, by prompting that data and giving that AI part of your knowledge when you're prompting it, you're essentially helping the AI replace you one day in the workplace, which I thought was really interesting.
Maureen, based off your work with Indigenous and rural communities around this topic, can you explain a little bit of the harmful things that you have seen due to this landscape and like what your research is really focused on? Is there any like specific case studies of the real harm that's going on in a way that feels a little bit tangible for us to understand and kind of feel the gravity of that?
I think the most harmful kind of use case that I've seen is surveillance, and it's happening kind of in a lot of countries that are more or less democratic. I mean, it's happening right here in America. There's been like a lot of articles that have come out about surveillance in Minneapolis around some of the protesters, but it's also happening in one of the communities that we're working with in Kalinga. They're a former Marxist communist kind of insurrectionist community. They've, the government has been using basically some of the apps that they've been using or their digital communications to kind of monitor what they're doing. That's just an example from one of the communities that we're working with, but it's something that's happening, I would say, everywhere. Data is also being used to like target communities with mis and disinformation around the world, influence operations. There's just very, very nefarious ways that you can use.
Vijayta, I don't know if you want to add anything else, like just based off of your work in the urban tech space, just domestically. I mean, we're talking about surveillance here. We're talking about restrictions on freedom of speech in the broader terms, what we've been seeing, but anything specific to the urban tech space that you've seen?
Yeah, I absolutely. By and large, to also contextualize, we sort of moved away from the term urban tech over the last few years.
Okay.
And the terminology keeps changing. And as an organization, we sort of evolved to focus more on climate and sustainability tech. And I, at least during the last few years that I was at the organization. But I think, kind of maybe taking it more to like broadening it from data to like the deployment of technology that sort of overlaps with like data collection and understanding data. This is also another area in which like Marine, like basically PrEP and CivLab and a couple of other organizations started collaborating. And it's around the gathering and processing of environmental data such as air quality, water quality, soil quality around, for example, New York City. There's a lot, like the city and the state, they deploy basically like environmental data like gathering sensors. There's different sensors for water quality, for air quality, for soil quality. I'll take air quality as an example. So you have the city deploying their own monitors, the state deploying their own monitors, and increasingly you have hyperlocal community-centered environmental data gathering initiatives because and I think one of the sort of catalysts for initiatives like this, and these initiatives are usually collaborations between academic institutions and community-based organizations who kind of collaborate to undertake these very specific, very community-centered data gathering projects. But I think one of the impetuses for such work is the reality that a decision such as like every decision around this technology impacts the output, right? So where you place a sensor determines the quality of information you're getting about the local environment. That can impact not only the information about, for example, the air quality in a neighborhood, for example, that gets disseminated to the people in that neighborhood or in the city at large, but it also has an impact on policy-making decisions upstream. Right? Because data is power, data is policy, data is outcomes, right? Like city outcomes. And something that the resident of any community will tell you is that to measure, for example, air quality in the south of the Bronx, which is in South Bronx, which is one of the most polluted communities in New York City because it is ringed by highways, and then also has a lot of warehouses lining its waterfront and trucks that come in and out and idle on the sidewalk waiting for shipments, etc. It is one of the most polluted places in the city and has like generational asthma and other air quality related illnesses because of it, like history of it. But the placement of sensors are, for example, on top of roofs. That's not where you're going to, according to any resident, that's not where you're going to get the most accurate reading of what the air quality is. You have to place it at street level. What does the average person experience? And so these small decisions, I think, maybe complement some of the examples that Marine was giving, just about like also the lack of understanding between like the way data can be collected, also that in ways that can positively impact communities, but like the lack of community-centric experiences that goes into these decisions. And so you're seeing a lot of hyperlocal environmental data collection projects that are being undertaken in the south of the Bronx, for example. There's also a citywide project called Floodnet that is a collaboration between a few academic institutions and community-based organizations to essentially have a very comprehensive set of monitoring tools available and accessible to measure flooding in New York City. And the data is going to be available to community members in an accessible way, but also to stakeholders that can actually do something to mitigate flooding and flood risk in NY. So that's like one example. That also brings me to like the collaboration that brought PrEP, CivLab, and a couple of other organizations, Unified Ground and Haviland Software together, called AI Empower, to essentially think about, we have all of these hyperlocal air quality, like environmental data monitoring projects that are proliferating across New York City. How can we utilize AI and AI tools to sort of synthesize this data and actually like enable communities to have self-determination over their own community resilience by basically generating a comprehensive picture on how different environmental disasters or like climate crises or hyperlocal environmental weather events, extreme heat or rain events, for example, could impact their communities and also enable them to have better hyperlocal response. Because climate, for example, affects different.
So the next question I have is that everything that we've talked about is kind of like seeing and highlighting the harm that is out there. But Marine, if you want to talk more about kind of the inspiring examples that you have seen based off of your work, what can we be hopeful for in the future now that we are considering these things, but not falling into this really negative doomsday kind of perspective. Not that I think that Vijayta, you were doing that at all.
I mean, I was going to hype Marine up for a second too and be like,
Yeah.
Marine does a great job of actually sort of, in her work, of marrying like these big abstract or like these bigger sort of high level constructs and concepts with what's happening on the ground, like, which is why I think what
You
Marine is
both
doing is
do.
so cool.
Yeah. And both of you,
You definitely do as well, Vijayta.
yeah, you both do. And that's kind of what I'm talking about here. It's like, I really appreciate the detail of like everything, this things that are unseen. And I had this conversation yesterday with the founder because we were talking about this concept of deep listening. And I'm like, that's what gets ignored. It's like this deep listening, the context. You can't just, innovation, it feels super fast sometimes, like testing, you're not really considering the small things, the nuanced things that get overlooked. And what you are saying is a small adjustment saves money, improves the data being collected, improves the solution by just saying the people are saying that they're breathing the air at this level rather than the data being collected from the top. It's so small, and it's kind of, these adjustments are so crucial, and so people who have an eye for that are really important, and I admire that for both of you. But yeah, Marina, if you have anything to share about the aspiring stories.
Before I talk about the positive examples, like just to kind of summarize some of, I think, the systemic harm that we've seen. The first is dependency. And I think the kind of examples feed into that because they're kind of a response to that. The first is dependency, so depending on foreign infrastructure, foreign data. The second is erasure, so like African or, other global South languages not being included, or just data in general, knowledge systems not being included into how these tech systems are developed. And the third is like surveillance being used against the populations that it's supposed to serve. And so from that, I think there's a few examples that have like really been interesting. And I think we're very lucky because in our work, we get to engage with a lot of these organizations. And it's really the people who lead these organizations as well are always so inspiring. And they're often women, which I think is amazing. One of them is Ushahidi. They're a Kenyan organization, and they became massive basically during the protest of 2007. There was a lot of political unrest around election results, and a lot of those protests turned violent. And so they created an app that was open only for protesters, where they were sharing kind of like where the violence was happening, any of the incidences that like protesters should be aware of. And they made this like widely available, and then you could report an incident and then share that with, you know, the people as well who were participating in the protests. And they made like that widely available to the people who were protesting, but closed it off completely to anybody from the government. And so it was really kind of like a way to like promote that kind of like democratic right that these protesters had without, you know, taking away the surveillance angle that you might have.
Very
Another
cool.
really fascinating project that we've been working with is in southern Philippines, Mindanao, which is a country that's seen a lot of unrest. And we're working with this like university. It's like quite a small university, and they're building natural language processing, so essentially LLMs, ChatGPTs, but proprietary. They're not using any of the OpenAI technology with indigenous languages, endangered languages. And their goal is to make sure that these languages never disappear into like these bigger tech ecosystems that don't represent them. So they've been going around villages, collecting these languages with the communities, and then building these tools around them, which I think is really interesting. And then the communities get to govern how the data works. And I think it's a little bit similar to what we're doing in Malawi as well, where we're also trying to kind of create data sets of new languages that are not represented. And just in Malawi, it's crazy. The official language of Malawi is Chichewa, and we're trying to look for data sets to train the model that we're going to be developing. These data sets don't exist. That's how like the national language of a country, and we're unable to develop the tool because we don't have the data set. So we're building our own data sets, going around villages again and collecting the voice.
I guess to bring it back to the New York, just like US context, I think I get my hope from seeing what community-based or organizations on the front lines of the climate and environmental crisis are actually doing. Like that's kind of where I remember that like all hope is not lost, and that's kind of what keeps me from being wildly cynical all the time. The organization that is doing local air quality monitoring in the South Bronx, they're called South Bronx Unite, and they're an advocacy. They do a lot of community-driven advocacy for the South Bronx, but they have sort of evolved into actually placing the largest network of community air quality monitoring sensors in the country, in the world. I forget, but I think in the country they have over 50 sensors, and now they're, I think, to my knowledge, figuring out how to actually operationalize it in terms of making community tools for residents, but also kind of using it as advocacy down the line, right? To advocate for better like air quality sort of policy or adjacent policy in the neighborhood, in the locality. Then I think I mentioned FloodNet, which is the community-driven and centric flood monitoring project in New York City. And then some other examples, I guess, to kind of mention the participatory grant-making work I did while at CivLab. We had the opportunity to create and deploy an intermediary climate grant-making fund between 2022 and 2025. And we essentially acted as a pass-through. We channeled corporate funding into place-based climate grants in New York City, Michigan, and LA County. And in building this mechanism, our sort of guiding ethos was that if we are giving money to, like, giving funding towards place-based climate action, it is the communities in each place that should actually play an integral role in deciding where that funding goes. So we sort of acted as stewards in that process, and we facilitated conversations amongst the different advisory committees that we had in all three places who made the final funding decisions. And it was very interesting to see the technological solutions that actually ended up being funded through our mechanism, because a lot of them, like, I think what was prioritized ultimately was founders who were either from or had a good knowledge of the communities that they were trying to deploy technological solutions in. And so I think, and a story that is very dear to CivLab as well, something that we are a big champion of, is this organization in Detroit or in Michigan called Just Air that essentially deployed air quality sensors in this very air quality vulnerable neighborhood in Dearborn, which is also a place that has experienced a lot of environmental racism and redlining. And they basically have a dashboard that residents can use and access that like helps them like through their phones, that basically like helps them understand immediately what they must do if the air quality is bad, because there's also that gap of understanding, right? Do people actually know what that means and what is within their power to do? And I think what it's also led to them working with city and state governments, I think that to actually help build this like an understanding of like their technology and like these dashboards into how they sort of operate at the city level as well, which I think is really cool. And then another example in LA is this organization called Smart Air LA that I think it like at least in terms of sending alerts to residents or like people within frontline communities that also are comprised of mainly immigrants to the state. Essentially, like they wanted to send like like environmental quality updates to predominantly immigrant communities in California or in parts of LA County, but then found themselves having to act as wildfire alert providers during the fires that just ravaged LA. And their whole thing was they send text message alerts in Mandarin and in Spanish, which, and again, in text-based format, which is something that doesn't really like the translation system, right? Like you don't understand the seriousness of a situation. So they were able to sort of culturally tailor messaging in terms of wildfire response.
Let's just take a moment because I want both of you to really come into the heart space and think about kind of like long-term, like what is your purpose right now, and like long term, what do you see for the future for the research you're doing, your collaboration? Would love to hear like what is kind of driving you both forward at this moment.
I'm very excited to see the prep work that we're doing expand. I think we're expanding to more and more countries. I think the projects that we're developing are taking bigger sizes and really becoming more important. I mean, the tool that we're building in Malawi is still at the pilot phase, and we're piloting in 4 districts. We are planning to make it like a national tool. We're working with the government there to kind of build this out as really just an institutional tool that all Malawans will eventually use in their local language. So that's something that's very exciting. It's been, as I said, quite exciting to see the demand for this work. And I think Vijayta and I are hoping to kind of take another angle at like this kind of decolonial approach that we're trying to bring to tech by hopefully being able to fund some projects in the future. So one of our goals is to create a fund where we'll be able to decide or kind of pick and showcase initiatives that are taking a decolonial approach, community-led approach, and supporting them in our one way, which I think is exciting.
And what about you, Vijayta?
I'm doing a few different things right now, so I'm definitely trying to just like in this new chapter, I'm trying to work with different people who inspire me and are trying to sort of build the same things that I am, which very much centers around how can we basically build new ways of being and doing outside of the current constructs, if I were to say it in the most abstract way possible. And I think one way that I think Marine and I really aligned is in this exploration of like what technology ecosystem that exists entirely outside of being co-opted by capitalistic agendas look like. What could a tech ecosystem that was actually grounded in community wisdom, indigenous practice, sustaining, preserving, and serving community need rather than being for profit, and like rather than being sort of inspired by or motivated by growth mindset, right? So like we're not just kind of deploying something and scaling it because we must. And I think when we think about these things, there's also this question, this whole other can of worms, which is a future conversation on degrowth, right? What does it look like to actually develop a tech product that serves community and that might not necessarily be centered around achieving profit or scaling, or actually being really intentional? And I think that's the big question that I sort of set out to answer, that I think Marine and I really align on. Like, these are big questions on how do you fund tech like this? How do you evaluate and find tech like this? Who is creating this tech, and how do you create safe spaces to nurture this process? What does that world look like? What principles and values does it exist on? And it's tech and it's also AI, right? And I think Maria and I have definitely found that like they exist in the same world, but they also exist side by side. Like one doesn't necessarily mean the other. So I think we're also then going to get into the nuances of like decolonial tech and decolonial AI and sort of like what are the overlaps, but then how should they also be treated as discrete things as well.
I was just going to add, and one of the things I think that's been really one of the biggest challenges in this space is funding and funding work like this, because I think as we've kind of discussed throughout this conversation, it's not necessarily the model that like private sector companies are after, even if it's a counter narrative now. And hopefully we're going to move towards something that's a bit more community and user oriented, because that's just the more resilient and sustainable way to do it. So I think that's also some of the questions that we're grappling with, is how you create funding models that are more sustainable.
Well, thank you both so much. Is there anything else that you would want to add?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, Vijayta, as well. I know it's late in India.
This was so nice. This was so, and thank you for like being patient with us, but I'm glad we got to have this conversation. Bye everyone. Take care.